Now we're going to continue with the theme of innovation and specific research. I'd next like to introduce Lynn Fiellin, who's an associate professor at Yale and is doing really tremendously interesting and innovative work thinking about using game theory and other novel approaches to promote health and to protect children from various kinds of health problems. So join me in welcoming Lynn. Yeah.
So some of you who may have heard me speak at the Center for Technology and Behavioral Health sometime in the last year. I've lost track of time. Some of this may be familiar to you in terms of one of the main projects that we've been doing, looking at video games as interventions for risk reduction and prevention, specifically in adolescents, but this is also to serve as kind of an update and also an overview for folks who haven't seen the work that we've been doing. So as just some brief background, I'm a general internist at Yale. I also have a clinical practice in HIV, and I also am an addiction medicine doc, so I sort of wear all of those three caps. So, which really begs the question is, how does an adult medicine doc end up developing video games for teenagers? That's another story, but really basically I wanted to start looking at primary prevention. And at the time, my husband and I had 5 kids who were all playing video games and were like, you know, just embalmed in video games. That's like all they did was on some device playing a game. And it seemed like it was a pretty compelling way to potentially deliver healthy messages to kids. And so ended up deciding to apply for a grant, which had nothing to do with technology or video games, but I decided that was a grant I was going to write. And be careful what you wish for, you may get it. And which was actually a huge opportunity, and that started this whole adventure, which has continued currently, and is really what I'm going to focus on, is talking about kind of the process that we went through with this one game, and then also kind of the overarching idea of using video games not only for intervention, but also as an assessment tool, which I think is sort of what a theme that we've been hearing both from Lisa and with the most recent talk, is really the notion of using technology both as a way of, you know, of intervening and impacting, but also as a very powerful way to collect very real data. So as far as the project that we received funding for, the goals specifically for that project were to develop an interactive mobile video game, mobile meaning we decided to use the iPad, designed to help young teens acquire and practice skills to avoid or reduce behaviors that increase their risk for HIV, as well as to rigorously evaluate its impact using standardized out-of-game assessments, so the paper and pencil assessments we're all used to using, as well as in-game data from the iPad software. I can say, while this RFA was focused on HIV prevention, we really took this opportunity to develop what ended up being an intervention that really covered a whole spectrum of risk behaviors. So there's a lot of content around sexual risk, around drug and alcohol use, and then on to bullying, cheating, unsafe driving. I mean, really decided we could, you know, affect potentially a lot of different risk behaviors in this population. So in line with what Lisa said, as we started developing this project, it became very clear that the need for a highly multidisciplinary team was absolutely key. That was and has continued to be the bottom line, and what I think has probably been most successful about this project. It took about 6 months to really develop that team and figure out who were the moving parts that we needed to have on board. But what you can see is that it is made up of a scientific side, a community side, and a game side. The scientific side is kind of the usual suspects, as you can imagine: pediatricians, behavioral scientists, addiction specialists, HIV specialists. The community side, which has absolutely been fundamental to doing this work, are, in this case, after-school programs and school-based programs in the New Haven area. So program staff, the kids in those programs, some of the parents involved with those programs. And they've been involved with every step of the development of the game, as well as now the clinical trial we've been conducting. So again, to a point that Lisa made, is really involving your target audience. That has been absolutely key. I think what we created came out of the kids, and so it's more likely to really have a positive impact on the kids. And then the game side was really, figuring out who was working in this area of serious games, which, just for a definition, is essentially games produced for things besides just entertainment. And then also bring on some commercial game developers to really help us make sure that what we were creating was fun, engaging, and all of these folks have continued to be really important to the whole process and what we created. And actually, in the middle is a picture of one of the first after-school program we worked with. We went in and took a bunch of photographs of those kids, which really make up our website. And so what we ended up creating was a game called Play Forward, Elm City Stories. New Haven is the Elm City, so that was a shout out to New Haven. And it was developed over the course of about 2 years. It's 16 hours on the iPad. And we, the whole developmental process, as I mentioned, there was a lot of interface with the community and with our target audience. But there was also a whole process in terms of how to embed health behavior change theory into this vehicle. As I mentioned, we decided to use the iPad because, in part because of the touch screen component. This was actually before the iPad was officially released, but I think given the sensitive nature of what we were trying to do and the notion that, if a child could kind of have this in their hand, close to them, have it be a personal experience, that it may actually have more of an impact than using like a desktop computer or a laptop. It's a role-playing game with an overarching story, recurrent characters that come in and out of the game. And the first step is the player builds what we've coined the aspirational avatar, which helps build me power. And the aspirational avatar really builds on the idea that an avatar is a physical representation of you or your character. The aspirational avatar is the notion of really building beyond that. What are the goals? What are the values? Who does this player see themselves down the road? What's important to them? And the game allows them the capacity at the beginning to build some of that into their character and take that throughout the game with them. So I don't know if anyone ever played the game of life, right? So I remember my favorite thing was having the little car and like putting the twin girls in the car and putting the other things and kind of going through life, and I get my college degree. And that was like my package, right? That's what I took through life with me. And that was important. When they started taking things away, it didn't feel good. So it was that sort of notion of having our player go in with something important to them that they could risk losing if they made bad decisions. Another component of the game are 4 mini games, which really are skill-based games targeting areas that we wanted to see the players practice over and over again in an engaging, somewhat transparent way to teach them these skills. So we have our knowledge game, which is no sense. We have our self-efficacy around refusal game, which is our refusal power game. People sense is essentially helping kids go through a process of learning how to assess people and situations to figure out what's risky and what's not, how to say yes or no, and based on data that you collect about people or situations. And then there's priority sense, which sort of helps kids learn how to balance short and long-term priorities such that they can get a better sense of the decisions I make today can have an either positive or negative impact on my life down the road. So this was sort of what we ended up with, a final kind of plan for the game, and you can sort of see all the moving parts. There's the lifeline, which is really sort of a whole series of what we call challenge stacks, but are sort of narratives that provide sort of a challenge that the player then has to navigate through, making decisions that interface closely. Oops, are we on? We must be on. That interface closely with the mini games so that they build more power or senses through the mini games, which then helps them to navigate through the stories more effectively. And then you can see the aspirational avatar is over here. And then there's also an epilogue, which is essentially, you can always fast forward to the epilogue and see where you are in your game, in your life, how your decisions have impacted on your overall life outcome, and then go back and change that in the game, and then that's reflected in your epilogue. So there's this notion of being able to sort of go back and forth between now and later and see how, you know, your behaviors or decisions can impact your overall outcome. So I'm just going to show you some screenshots. I have my iPad, so if anyone at any point in the day wants to come play, you can find me. This is just an example of the home page when the player starts. At this point, you can essentially choose either a boy or a girl. We allowed kids to choose boys. They could play either as a boy or a girl. The game would be different if you were a boy or a girl, just because characters were different and some of the storylines were different. So I think what we aimed to do was to create a gender sensitive as opposed to necessarily a gender specific game. But, you know, we left it up to the player how they wanted to play. You name the player and you kind of go through the process of, as I mentioned, is, you know, developing your aspirational avatar. And you can kind of see that these are the 12 challenge stacks that go from 7th through 12th grade. So it's sort of the life of sort of middle school and high school. And then the mini games, and then the fast forward is where you can fast forward to your epilogue. And this is an example of one of the screens, just sort of showing how we have these tools that the kids can use. This is, again, all touch screen. And if you hit on the purple tool, then your people sense is activated, and you essentially move through each scene, sort of finding key points, which is either informational or they're points where you have to unlock a key point by playing one of the levels of the mini game. So again, it kind of moves the player back and forth between skill building, practicing, and then making decisions within the story. And there you can see down at the bottom here is where they keep tally of their key points. And in this case, once you've gotten 5 key points, you would be able to move on to a different scene. This is another scene. This is one that comes up with this is one of the stories that talks about prescription drug use at schools. Sort of this is part of the challenge that you have to work through in terms of how you as a player help negotiate what happens, making certain choices, being able to see what happens if you make the wrong choice or you make the right choice and what those consequences are. This is one of the me power aspirational avatars, sort of as you begin, and you're sort of prompted to go back and forth to the aspirational avatar. This was a concept that we felt was really important and was part of this notion of building future orientation. With this project, we did sort of what I would sort of say is a rudimentary treatment of this. I think it could really be built out. At this point, it really just sort of includes these domains at the bottom, as you can see: who I am, hobbies, stuff, career, my home, people, my health, priorities, and dreams. And the player sort of builds those things. And this is what one of the screens look like. And those things are also reflected in the epilogue, because how you play in the game impacts on things that you've built into your aspirational avatar, and that comes together in the epilogue. This is one of the knowledge game screens. So the knowledge game is really based on imparting knowledge to kids in a way that is hopefully more engaging, is more likely to stick, and you really sort of play in the role of having to debate back and forth about, so information can be presented that's incorrect, and you're given a set of options to come back and say, this is the correct answer. And so it's really that sort of, and it employs sort of an ability to choose from a set of facts so that you actually not only say, this is the right answer, but this is why it's the right answer, because I have a fact to back it up. This is a screen from our refusal game, and the refusal game really, as all the mini games are based on literature and evidence to support what are really well-established, effective ways for to refuse situations or people that may be risky. So for instance, to go through a series of steps of refusing, the first one is, what is this person really asking me to do? Like, what are they, what's the message behind what they're asking me to do? The second step is, how can I get myself out of this but still save face? What are some of those strategies? I can make a joke, I can make an excuse, I can just say no. And it goes through those steps. And for instance, with refusal, with all the mini games, there are 10 levels. And so over and over again, the player is really going through the same steps and learning those strategies by doing it interactively with, with the characters in the game. So with the hope that, again, they just sort of, this kind of becomes embedded into their way of thinking about, in real life, how would I refuse a situation that might be risky to me? This is the People Sense game. The girls in our study tend to love this game because they love to think about their friends and their social network. And essentially, this is what this game is about, is how to build your social network based on information so that people who are safe are closest to you, and people who might be more risky are put on the outskirts of your social circle. So you go through this process where you choose, you highlight each of your friends, and you get information about them, and then you choose where they belong. Are they a best friend because they're really clearly are, a good person who's going to have a positive influence on you, or do they look like they're potentially bad news, in which case you want to put them farther away from you. And once you've placed everyone on your network, you then are invited to do things. You're invited to do something with somebody, with other people potentially along for the ride. So what the player then has to do is think about, okay, who's inviting me? Are they good or bad? Who's going along? Because I think the other skill we really want to teach kids is it's not always the person that you may think, oh, well, he's a good friend, he's okay. But you can be really impacted by the people who are also along there as well. And I think kids tend to lose sense of the fact that, it's the whole circle that can be risky, not just the one person who may be, may have invited you. And then it's taking into account what the situation is and sort of putting those pieces together and deciding whether it's, sounds good and clicking on green, or another time, because this does not sound like a good constellation of either people or situations, and this may have a bad outcome. Priority is one of the other mini games, and again, this is really, trying to balance, short-term and long-term gains or losses and priorities and how those can kind of fit together, as well as sort of having, and this is what this is shot. What the wheel represents is that there's also a component of luck in there. I mean, we can sometimes make the best decisions, and yet things aren't necessarily going to work the way we choose them or want them to work because of just chance. So this is sort of the whole kind of landscape of the game. Again, it really pulls the player through the stories, through the decision making, through the mini games, building these powers and senses so that you can then progress through the stories, make the decisions, with the goal being is to have the best outcome, which would be reflected in your epilogue. Just we've had some good responses, both from the serious games field. We were invited to do a Google Tech Talk last summer, so if you also have interest in hearing more about serious games or about this project specifically, you can Google us and find our talk on YouTube. So the next step was really to sort of see, well, now that we've created this thing, and I'm proud to say that we're actually only 3 weeks late in our production, which to me was a major accomplishment, but to kind of figure out what, does this thing work, and how to evaluate that. And I think Lisa raised a good point, made me thinking about different ways of looking at technology, sort of maybe more outside the box from our conventional, RCT approach and all that. Having said that, we sort of did the conventional RCT, and since that's what I live and breathe, so it seemed like at that point it was a good place to start. So we began this randomized control trial, again, keeping it within the after-school programs. We actually went out to, and actually are finishing going out to 15 after-school programs. We come in with rolly bags and iPads and headphones, and we plug them in, and our goal was 330 teens, ages 11 to 14. We did this throughout the whole year, so included summer programs. And kids were randomly assigned to either play forward or a set of control games on the iPad. And that ranged, and they were given a whole menu of 12 games on their iPad if they were one of the control participants. And that was everything from puzzle games and math games to just fun games like Angry Birds. The design was that they would play twice a week for 6 weeks, or 12 sessions, 15 hours of gameplay. And notably, the iPad, all of it is time-stamped data, which is collected through the game software. And then we also collected web-based assessments at specific intervals to evaluate for knowledge, self-efficacy, intentions, behaviors, and then sort of a whole set of data that we collected at different intervals. And so some of the results to date, so I can say, well, I'll get to that. Part of the other evaluation that we did was qualitative interviews. So we did interviews with, since the gameplay was 6 weeks, we did qualitative interviews with each of the participants at the end of the 6 weeks of gameplay, focusing mostly on the kids who played play forward, since that was, really what we wanted some of the feedback on, although there were questions that we asked all the kids. So as far as the play forward group, the majority described the goal as to make good choices to get a better future. They described it as fun, interesting, cool, and inspiring. 85% reported that they would recommend the game to a friend. And reasons they reported for recommendation included they felt that they had better decision-making skills, better sense of the future, increasing knowledge about sex, drugs, and alcohol. And they also reported that they felt like it was translatable to their real life, which was obviously one of the major goals and challenges, was to make it feel like it was meaningful enough that it would resonate. Anecdotally, a lot of the kids also asked if they could download it from the App Store when they were done. So to me, that was a pretty important, kind of compelling piece of information, that they did want to keep playing. So as I mentioned, we started our trial on February 26, 2013. We've been in 15 programs throughout New Haven. 301 adolescents were randomized as of when I wrote this slide. We're now up to 325, so we have 5 kids left to enroll in this study, which is really exciting. Of those 301 adolescents, 47% were boys. The mean age was 13. 161 had completed 6 weeks of gameplay. About that had completed the 3-month follow-up assessments. And what we were just seeing, again, just preliminary data, was no significant baseline between group differences, which is what we wanted, and comparable net play time was about 10 hours on average. Number of play sessions was about 9, and then playtime per session was about 60 minutes. So that's essentially what we were aiming for, and we saw that actually in both the control group and the experimental group. In sort of the small group that we had 3-month data on, we saw higher knowledge and we saw higher self-efficacy scores. We did not look at any frank behavioral data at this point, but in terms of sort of those behavioral antecedents, we certainly saw some promising effects in our group. I can say the self-efficacy scores that we looked at really were focused primarily on drug use refusal skills. So that was, that was nice to see at this point. Again, very preliminary. And then we also started looking at our log files, which is really just overwhelmingly huge amounts of data. And after listening to Professor Campbell talk about data, it is, this is a major, major challenge of how to look at all this data. I mean, it's great to see it come in, but it's a real challenge on how to look at it in a meaningful way. So we started to design some systems of how to look at this log file data. And one of the things that we found was that, again, just to try to start developing preliminary systems, was that we could document that looking at the log files that were generated by the iPad software, that there was a positive correlation between knowledge gains measured at 3 months on our assessments and the exposure to certain content in the game. We can map the content in the game to specific questions on our assessments, and we could see that those were well correlated. So it was as a first glance to figure out what may be important in this software data, certainly looking at being able to document exposure to certain parts of this intervention seemed to be a fairly powerful way to look at this data. And that really sort of brought about this idea of, and I think this sort of speaks to a lot of different forms of technology, is sort of how to look at this type of data that's generated from technology in the behavior change research space. And I in no way have an answer to that, because it is totally outside of my skill set. But I think it's really important. I think technology holds the promise of, as we said, not only as intervention, but also as a very powerful assessment tool. So in the case of the iPad data, it automatically records the player's experience, and then you can essentially take that and put those into places and look at it. Again, this is not what I do, but it certainly is is interesting to start thinking about what the applications may be. So this is just a very simple figure sort of showing 4 players, and the x-axis is total game time in minutes, and then the y-axis is a total score on a particular one of the mini games. And again, it's just being able to document is that the longer they play, they seem to accomplish a higher score, which is certainly what you want to see: learning, progressing, moving forward. Certainly gets more complicated when you start adding everybody in. And again, this is very much a work in progress. I think my purpose, because we're just generating some of these figures, some of this data, is really just more to start developing hypotheses about how to look at this data and what may be most meaningful. I think for me, the starting point is really to think about game exposure and what parts of the game and what kids are exposed to, can we see how that is associated with how they do on assessments. And we tend to design interventions that many of them are complex and multifaceted, and we get a result at the end and say, yes, it's effective, but we really don't know what's working, what's effective, what part of it has the biggest bang for its buck. So there's some ability, I think, here to be able to look at this type of an intervention and see what exposure really leads to the biggest impact. And to me, that's really important, because maybe we don't need 15 hours of gameplay. Maybe we only need 4 hours of gameplay of this one specific part, and that may really be the way to figure that out. So again, this is just some of our ways of starting to look at that. And if we look at the 4 different mini games we have and sort of try to figure out what exposure to one of those games, how that ultimately impacts on outcomes. Granted, they're self-reported outcomes, but that's, in this study, that's, sort of what we have. We're not collecting biological data. But I think that there's a lot of promise in that, and to be able to really see what is most impactful about our intervention. So again, does the time spent playing the game predict a positive outcome, or is it the score that matters? All these things, is time really a variable we want to look at? Because time can be spent very productively. They're learning, they're practicing, they're getting better, or they're spinning their wheels. And they're not, they're frustrated, they're not understanding, they're not learning. So it's really figuring out what variables are most important. And this figure basically just sort of shows, again, with the x-axis being total hours of gameplay and the y-axis being the stacks beaten. The stacks is as I mentioned, the challenge stacks, the stories, and the number of the score that you can get, the points you can get. And you can kind of see based on this that, at 6 months, we could show some evidence that, if you had, the optimal number of hours and the optimal number of stacks beaten, that was reflected in your knowledge scores on our standardized assessments. So there was a good correlation between knowledge gains based on not only on achievement in the game, but also on time spent playing the game. And this just breaks it down further in terms of sort of looking at the quartiles of the knowledge obtained. And again, just sort of another way to look at this is stacks beaten versus percent change. And we can see, that, and this was at 3 months, that again, the more stacks beaten, the higher level of knowledge acquired based on our assessments. So again, it's sort of very, very simple first steps, looking at this data, looking at the iPad data in conjunction with the standardized data and trying to figure out how that may add to what we can say about what this game is doing and what kids are learning or how their behavior is potentially changing. This is just 6 months. We see the trend again continuing. So before I go to next steps, I think to think about, for this project, as I mentioned, we were in after-school programs. We were not in clinical settings, but I think in terms of the applications of this type of work could be very important in clinical settings, be it treatment program settings, be it general medical settings. I think the use of this type of technology, it may be a little bit more on the fly. It may be an app that they download that they can play when they're in a treatment program or as part of an adjunct to counseling. But I think that there's a lot of clinical application to this, because this is really, and we've seen this experience with kids, this is where they are. These teenagers, you give them an iPad, they just go at it. We walk through a tutorial with them, but they really know how to do this. They don't, they're, if you will, hardwired to do this. So I think it can easily translate to them. This game is at this point way too big to be on a phone, but some of the other games that we're developing are, smaller and can be done on cell phones, and I think could really travel with kids, which I think is one of the best ways to give them a dose, because it's where they are. So as far as this study, we're completing enrollment actually in the next 2 weeks, and we're currently collecting 12-month data on one cohort and should have 6-month data on the entire sample by October or November. We're further assessing the efficacy of the aspirational avatar and thinking about building that out a little bit more. We're developing systems of evaluating player profile to optimize the targeted outcomes. So in other words, really start looking at, are there certain aspects of a player that they're going to be more likely to respond well to certain parts of a game. And that's complicated and takes sort of a certain level of expertise, and we've actually brought on a postdoc who specifically that's what she does, is look at gamer profiles and figures out what is most effective, in terms of reaching certain types of gamers. And we're also in the process of translating the game to Android platforms, which may expand in terms of our ability to get it out there, as well as also desktops, laptops, PCs, Macs. And then thinking about exploring distribution channels, which was sort of the last part, development, evaluation, and then how to get it out there, which is a challenging but incredibly important step, because you can spend all this time doing this, testing it, say it does this, and then it doesn't reach anybody. So that is something that we're very actively exploring. We also have 2 new projects. We're developing a mobile game called Play It Safe for HIV prevention in young Black women specifically. So that's focusing more on secondary prevention, be it HIV testing, condom use, that type of thing. And then we were very fortunate to receive pilot funding from Dartmouth Center for Technology and Behavioral Health, and we are developing Smokescreen, which is a mobile game for cigarette and marijuana prevention in young teens, and that's actually now on Android phones. So it's got to have the kinks worked out, but it's getting there. So that's very exciting. So that's it. Thank you very much.